Hello, everybody. I'm Katherine Gibson, and I'm joining this conference by a video recording, which I'm making here in my office at home. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak to you at this conference, and thanks to the translators who will make my words accessible to a wider range of people. I'm actually speaking to you here from my home in Sydney, on the banks of the Georges River. At the moment, we're in a very unprecedented flood event, but luckily my river is not one of the ones that's being flooded. So I'm quite safe, quite high up above this Georges River. But I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of this land. I'm living in Sydney at the boundaries of the Gadigal, Darug and Dharawal nations. And this land was never ceded. It always was and always will be Aboriginal land. And I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and I join with them to care for country. Today, with the huge awakening all over the world of what must happen for Black lives to really matter, I don't feel that I can leave my acknowledgement of country just there. I have to also acknowledge that the people whose livelihoods and freedoms were lost in the process of my family moving from relative poverty in England and Scotland in the early mid-19th century to membership, then moving up into membership of an educated middle class in just one generation at the expense of the people of this country. Both the settlers, the Aboriginal people of Western Sydney, where my descendant convict great-great-grandfather worked over there in that Regentfeld mansion, but also the South Sea Islanders who came to work on the plantations in Queensland that my grandfather grew up on, and the land of Gunnedah Bay where he then settled when he moved to Sydney. I grew up knowing very little about this history, and I'm so grateful that I'm finally finding out the true history of the country I live in. This relatively new social practice of recognising past violence and the ongoing amplification of inequality across generations in this white settler society is a small step towards redressing epistemic and racial injustice. It's a social innovation of sorts, but it's only one minuscule change of habit that must be followed by much larger actions of repair and reconciliation. Well, this conference is focused on social innovations against social, environmental and epistemic injustices. And it situates us at the crossroads of possibility. The call for papers draws out the distinction between solutions-oriented, technocentric innovation and emancipatory, justice-oriented social innovation. And in doing so, it evokes a common positioning that I'd like to suggest might perhaps stand in the way of possibility. So social innovation is often allied to social entrepreneurs, to the public good, to grassroots small-scale solutions, to some extent to reactive dynamics that are responding to market failure or gaps in the provision of state goods, public goods. Whereas technical innovation is often seen as central to the dynamism of capitalism. It's what stimulates market growth. It provides benefit to all, and it gives big solutions that are often associated with ruptures, creative destruction, and so on. So my interest is thinking about, do we actually need to line up elements of innovation in this way? And what might be enabled if we start to queer this binary? So in my talk, I want to look at what the community economies approach might have to offer here in thinking about the possibilities that we're at the crossroads of. My work with Julie Graham, and we published and still publish, despite Julie's death 10 years ago now, as J.K. Gibson Graham. And my work with J.K. Gibson Graham and with members of the Community Economies Collective is committed to a politics of possibility. And we've approached this by identifying three interconnected arenas of politics. A politics of language that's connected with reframing, a politics of the subject that's very involved with the idea of resubjectivation, and a politics of collective action. And in particular, we've followed this through by pursuing forms of action research. And I want to introduce our approach very briefly. I'm not sure how many people would know of our work, so I want to introduce you briefly to these politics, and I'll dwell in more depth on the last, politics of collective action, as this is where social innovation, I think, most directly enters into the picture. And I'll end my presentation with some options for further discussion, and I'll invite you to explore what happens when we queer the lineup of characteristics that are associated with each kind of innovation, social innovation, as opposed to technical innovation. So first, the politics of language and what economic reframing has to offer. And this is what we really broached in our first book, Julie and I, in 1996, The End of Capitalism as We Knew It, a feminist critique of political economy. In that book, we kind of challenged the idea that there was no alternative to capitalism. And we saw this language of capitalism as limiting the opportunities for thinking beyond it. And we coined the idea of capitalocentrism, the way that economic theory really set up capitalism as the ideal of an economy. It was a system of knowledge that then enrolled all kinds of economic identity into one system, positioning all sorts of practices as either just the opposite, a subordinate to, a complement of, or somehow existing within capitalism's orbit. So here we are drawing on the work of Jacques Derrida and his notion of logocentrism, and the application of that in post-structuralist feminism, the idea of phallogocentrism, where man is set up as the ideal of the human and woman is only ever this kind of faint shadow in relation to this central human subject. So when we transposed that into thinking about economy, we could see that there were so many barriers to starting to think about other kinds of economy, alternative economies. And in fact, when we thought about this, we could see that capitalism was the center of dynamism. This system that was focused on wage labor, on commodity markets, and on business, private enterprise, was where all the innovation was seen as occurring, led by pioneering individuals, by competitive challenges, involving then these incredible technological revolutions that people saw as bringing forward new waves of productivity that regenerated this system that was always able to kind of recreate itself despite its tendency towards crisis. We were very much involved in this kind of political economic thinking, but we got to the point where saying, well, how do we ever have revolution? How do we ever change and get out of this system? Socialism has now failed. The alternative, the other, has gone. Is there an outside to capitalism? And we really started to think about all the different activities that were maintaining livelihoods, that were creating well-being, that were excluded from this vision of the economy. And we came up with the idea of a diverse economy, which initially was represented as an iceberg here. It's an image that people in community work really warmed to, because they could see themselves then as being part of something that they often were seen as excluded from because they didn't have a job or weren't involved in business. So this idea of a diverse economy was a way of breaking down the centrality of capitalocentrism. And it really was developed then by drawing on work within economic anthropology, within work on informal economies, and of course, feminist thinking, to try and identify and really inventory all the different kinds of forms of labor, forms of transaction, forms of enterprise, forms of property ownership, forms of finance and investment that were different from the kind of idealized visions that made up the capitalist economy, which are seen there in the top cells of these columns. Now, this was a move to try and identify economic heterogeneity as a way of moving beyond this idea that the only economy was the capitalist economy. And this kind of reframing of economy, bringing up a language of a diverse economy, was elaborated then in multiple books after we wrote The End of Capitalism. First of all, a collection of books around class as something that had multiple forms and different kinds of class processes coexisted in our modern society, including feudalism and slavery. We then republished The End of Capitalism with a new introduction in 2006, but alongside that, we wrote another book called The Post-Capitalist Politics, where we really started to inhabit this language in a different way. For us, politics of language opened up possibility. And it opened up the idea that there could be dynamism all over a diverse economy, in a more than capitalist economy. It opened up the idea that there might be social innovations that could have transformative effects all over the economy. So the next politics that we tried to develop more in this book, A Post-Capitalist Politics, was the idea of the subject. And here we were really attacking the idea that there was only one agent of history, you know, the working class subject, the centered notion of the solidary worker. With the idea of a decentered subject coming out of post-structuralism and being developed within feminist thinking, we could see that all people are multiply situated with respect to different kinds of subject positions. We are all both occupying many different identities as parents, as carers, as workers, as volunteers, as contributors to community, as carers for environment, and so on. So there are many different subject positions we can occupy, not only those that are sort of endowed with more and more agency within a capitalocentric vision. The idea of the independent, rational economic subject whose motivations are listed here. We could see that there are many other kinds of subjectivities that were connected to producing material support, producing well-being, producing sharing and distribution of surplus. And these were, in fact, economic subjectivities. So our vision was really tied into establishing a different kind of relationship to the subject, and in fact, a different kind of academic subject as well. Stepping away from the kind of critical, paranoid, radical subject who was always trying to pierce the veil of ideology and see what was at the base of any kind of contradiction or crisis, this idea that we could actually step away and become open and trusting and exploratory subjects that would allow for new kinds of possibilities to emerge outside of these very restrictive structures. And part of our work was to start to imagine a different subject, economic subject position as members of community economies. And here we were using the term community in a way, I guess, that was quite specific, drawing on the work of the French philosopher Jean-Luc Nancy, who sees community as not a sameness or as an essential being, but as a kind of a question and a call to ask us to make lives together, to recognize our inherent interdependence, the way in which we are born into the world already in relation with others, being with, being together, being in common. And if we put this at the center of our thinking as the ground for thought and politics, how do we start to become different kinds of subjects that are always becoming? And our notion of a community economy was, again, an idea that it was focused on the ethical actions that could create different kinds of economies, economies that would be resilient, but would be nourishing for people and the planet. So the idea of a community economy asked us to think about the kinds of interactions and relationships within economies that could be motivated by different kinds of dynamics or ethics. So when we're thinking about work and labor, we were thinking of how do you put together different kinds of work so that you survive well. So the image here is not about the motivated worker who wants to get more money for less work, but the person that wants to live well by combining together different kinds of work, including unpaid, otherly paid, and perhaps even paid labor. When we think about transactions, we're not thinking about getting more for less, but thinking about the encounters that we can responsibly have with others through all sorts of transactions, some of which are in markets, Others are in ethical markets, and others are not mediated by market relations. When we're thinking about business, we're thinking about how business becomes a site for surplus wealth and wealth creation, and how that business is also a place where surplus is distributed. And how can businesses, enterprise, be a place where surplus is distributed to a wide range of people, including people beyond the bounds of the enterprise and perhaps even the environment. And when we're thinking about property, we're thinking about all the ways that we make and share the resources that we need to live with. And these kinds of forms of governance might be beyond legal private property relations, but include all sorts of other relations of collectivity or open access use. And lastly, when we're thinking about finance, we're thinking more about investing in futures rather than investing to get the best, highest return. And you can see that this kind of diverse economy has crossed out those actions, those enterprises, those transactions that are inherently unethical, and we're really including a range of different enterprises and activities and so on that can be reshaped in ethical terms to build community economies. How we do that, of course, is another story. So our work in opening up possibility was very centrally involved in having a different language of economy, creating a space for different subjects of economy, starting to define some ethical concerns, and then using this as the basis for stepping into the fray and being involved in collective action. So the post-capitalist possibilities we are interested in were that what would emerge from this kind of rethinking and form of resubjectivation. So the third kind of politics, the politics of collective action, is where, of course, we're thinking that social innovation is going to be a crucial element. And this work has been developed by many people within the Community Economies Collective and in the research network that's now expanded to include about 280 people around the world. And we also developed this work quite a lot in a book that Julie and I started before Julie died, and we wrote with Jenny Cameron and Stephen Healy, called Take Back the Economy, an ethical guide for transforming our communities. And this was a book that tried to take our thinking and render it into a much more popular format that people could use in communities, in workplaces, in all sorts of contexts, to start to think about how do you take back the economy and build ethical community economies. And the book has been translated into Korean, into Spanish by a Colombian group of linguists, and into Finnish. And in each of those cases, the connection has been quite closely linked into, the translation has been closely linked into community activities and community economy initiatives. And now it's also being translated into Greek, and recently the Mandarin version has just been published. So again, in some of these versions of the book, the local translators in connection with community activists have extended and included a lot more local examples into the collective action section of each of the chapters. And this is a really welcome kind of innovation, I think, for us as authors, to see our work not only translated, but extended in lots of different contexts. In Take Back the Economy, we posited a number of tools that communities and individuals could use to start to inventory the diversity around them, the economic diversity, their own diversity of subject positions, and the ways in which they might act to create different kinds of well-being, different kinds of ethical interactions. And here are just some of these kinds of metrics and inventory methods that we've used. And all of these, I guess, all of the examples of building community economies that we documented in this book are forms of social innovation. They're forms of organisation or initiatives where people are acting together. They're taking on ethical questions around economic justice or environmental sustainability. They're all involving all sorts of relational changes and trying to meet wider social goals. And this work has been extended even further into the publication just last year of the Handbook of Diverse Economies, which is a very weighty tome, unfortunately quite expensive. Although if you're interested to get a copy, we'd be interested to supply you one online. It has about 56 chapters written by 66 different authors, and it really starts to show you the wealth of scholarship that's taking place around this idea of diverse economies and building community economies. And it's, I guess it is, in a sense, the whole diverse economies school of thought has been a kind of an intervention, a social innovation that's built up over the last 20 years or so. So that brings me then to the question of what does this approach offer today to your discussion in the conference of the crossroads of possibilities and how we might use social innovation to speak back to the injustices that we're concerned about. And of course, the current situation is one in which we are confronting multiple crises. Of course, we've got the pandemic, the huge global crisis in the health area. We've also seen most recently the uprising of violence and the backlash to that racial violence and the incredible movements all across the world, the Black Lives Matter movements that are showing that this racialized violence has to end. In Australia, we have been, in particular in the last few weeks, confronted with the violence of sexual violence and gender violence, even in the context of our own Parliament House. And there's been a huge upwelling of support for feminist issues, gender equality, and against gendered violence. And of course, most recently, we've also confronted quite viscerally the impact of climate change with the incredible bushfires that raged across the country last year, and right now, incredible floods. So along with all of that, I think there's been the undeniable fact that inequality has not been lessening, but has been growing in many parts of the world and even in the developed, so-called developed world. So we have got a daunting set of crises confronting us. And interestingly, I think crises are often seen as times of possibility and even possibility for a social economy or for social innovation. And here I'm thinking about the work that the wonderful Robin Murray, the late Robin Murray, the work that he produced in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis. This book, Crisis, Danger and Opportunity, Crisis in the New Social Economy. In that book, Robin argued that this financial crisis was an opportunity for a new social economy to emerge, and that he saw this emerging out of the kind of distributed networks that were made possible by the changes in information technology, the ways in which production and consumption were being blurred, the way that collaborations and interactions were being fostered, different kinds of care and maintenance were being developed, and that there was a strong role for values and missions. And he had a very hopeful view that the financial crisis would be the trigger for greater growth in the social economy. And certainly, I think some of these things have occurred. Perhaps more of them, though, have occurred in the crisis that the pandemic has initiated. But even so, in his wonderful formulation, he did see social innovation as a reactive dynamics that would arise out of a financial crisis that was embedded in capitalism. So in a sense, even though he was, and always did, think beyond the box and was in so many ways thinking of a diverse economy, and I really appreciate his work so much for the way in which it stimulated those thoughts way back in his work with the Greater London Council. Was very influential on Julie and I in thinking about the end of capitalism in that book. But still there's that remnant Marxist kind of positioning of crisis in capitalism fostering then reactive dynamics in a social economy. And I guess I'm interested in seeing whether we might start to play with that kind of positioning, that dialectic, that that dualism. And in a way, COVID has started to help us do that. I mean, here we've seen a virus destabilize life and initiate and force all sorts of changes, social innovations. In Australia, we've seen our state government, our national federal government suddenly doing things they never would have thought of before. The homeless were suddenly homed. Suddenly unemployment benefits were doubled, and people started talking about people who'd lost their jobs through no fault of their own and having sympathy for them. Of course, there's an interesting dialectic there between somehow the deserving unemployed versus those others who are always unemployed and aren't deserving. But it started to really push at that relationship, and people started to realise that this society could afford to pay people a living amount to live in a dignified way. We've seen corporations starting to cooperate, at least medical researchers and some pharmaceuticals, at least until the vaccine started to be marketed. We've seen people working differently through Zoom, through Jitsi, through these sort of digital technologies, reshaping the nature of work and the workplace. And of course, we've seen the upwelling of care by people, face-to-face, people-to-people, gifting, reciprocity at the household level, on streets, in neighbourhoods. And we've seen the kind of growth of prosumption, this kind of connection of consumption and production happening in households with people doing, whether it's making their own bread or doing sewing or homeschooling, and showing in some ways, yes, the trials of doing that, but also the joyfulness of getting involved in production again. So there's been a lot of opportunities to rethink how life has been, what the old common sense was, what might be possible as a new common sense. And to some extent, there's been a kind of queering where the innovations have blurred between technical innovations and social innovations. And these have happened within a diverse economy, both within the so-called formal sector, the capitalist sector, and in households, in communities, in neighbourhoods, in social economies. So social innovation has been happening in unexpected places with different kinds of temporalities that are not necessarily tied to a capitalist business cycle, and even might be employing sort of outmoded technologies that are coming back into the fore. So I think a queering of social innovation and technical innovation starts to amplify the sites and possibility, the places for possibility. And I'd like us to be thinking through those a bit more, perhaps, in the context of this conference. So just to finish, I wanted to talk a little bit about two examples from my own research that I've been involved in recently. And the first one is a project I've just completed with others on the manufacturing sector in Australia, in which we interviewed and worked with a range of social enterprises, cooperatives, capitalist firms, transnational capitalist firms, and family businesses. And we found some very interesting innovations taking place within the manufacturing sector, where there was a kind of hybrid technical, social, and ecological innovation starting to take place. And one example is this taking place in the mattress manufacturing sector, where there's a huge ecological crisis of waste. Mattresses are one of the worst outputs in terms of waste management in landfill in Australia and all over the world. And people throw mattresses out and they just go into landfill and kind of keep surfacing as they get buried. And a wonderful social enterprise was generated to start to deal with this problem by reclaiming the mattresses and undoing them, taking them apart and reclaiming the materials of the steel springs and the inner spring mattresses that goes back to the steel manufacturers, the timber that gets used into wood chip and used in gardening and so on, and the foam and other padding that's getting used in uses for soundproofing and other kinds of mechanisms, other kinds of products. So Soft Landing is a social enterprise that employs people who are at a distance from the labour market, a lot of Aboriginal people who are out of prison, people who are long-term unemployed. And they developed this wonderful technique of recycling all the products And not only that, they started a conversation with the major mattress manufacturers in Australia. And together with these manufacturers, who are private capitalist businesses, they've developed a voluntary product stewardship scheme called Soft Landing. And so this involves a new kind of innovation in which when the sale of a new mattress, there is built into that the cost, an amount that will go into to covering the cost of recycling, full recycling. And what this has led to is a new innovation technically, even within the production process, where the manufacturers are now changing their production process to make their mattresses in such a way that will be slightly easier to do the deconstruction at the end of life of the product. So here we have an innovation that moved from a social innovation into a technical innovation. It produced proactive dynamics that started to intervene in the market and has affected a whole sector transformation in that particular manufacturing industry, that manufacturing sector. It's also had, of course, big impacts on ecologies. So here we see the kind of community economy concerns of building a better way of surviving well together, of distributing surplus through the provision of jobs, through putting private profits back into this social innovation of recycling. It's bringing a different kind of relationship between consumers and producers as the consumer buys a product that they know they can have responsibility for at its end of life. And it's provoking a different kind of consumption. So here's one of these kind of, I guess, an example of a kind of queering of technical and social innovation. The second example I wanted to bring to mind is a project that I've been involved in and is ongoing. It's called Cooling the Commons. And here, the challenge is the huge climatic problem of rising temperatures in cities like Sydney, where for many parts of the city in the western part, temperatures of 40 degrees during the days in summer and even up to 50 degrees are going to become more and more common. And of course, the big technological response to this is just to get air conditioning. Everybody should just have air conditioning. That's the kind of technical revolution that air conditioning produced in the world. As we know, it opened up whole new areas of the world to be settled, and say many parts of the southern parts of the US and so on, many parts of Asia. But of course, this technological solution produces its own ecological disasters. It creates even more heat in the urban area through the air that gets expelled from air conditioning. And it's expensive. Many people in Western Sydney are on very low incomes and they can't afford to have air conditioning, or if they can, they can't afford to have it running through the times that they need it to keep cool. So we've been involved in a project that starts to look at the generation of coolth. Coolth being the opposite of warmth, but comfort in a cooling environment that should be seen as something that is common, something that we make together and that we share in a generative and equal way across society. So we've been interested in using the idea of patterns to see how we might start to show what are the different cooling functions and affordances that can be generated in urban areas that are not only limited to inside areas, but also the areas between houses, on streets, in public space, that could be generated in a cool way to allow people to share and access this wealth of, or at least this sort of benefit, this well-being that can be given by cool environments. And as we've tried to re-theorize coolth as a commons that we make and share, we've been documenting all the different kinds of patterns that have been developed in different contexts all over the world. And many of them involve a sort of collective use, the need to kind of develop patterns of work and of access where we share that access and share that benefit. So it involves a different kind of urban subjectivity that takes people out of their isolated space where they might be sitting over a fan or over an air conditioner, and moving into a more collective space where commons and cooling can be shared. And this is going to involve, I think, a lot of interventions and innovations in behaviour, which of course means challenging the kind of patterns of behaviour that we've been schooled in, patterns of behaviour that have become common sense, re-invoking some of the patterns of behaviour that older generations have, who know and used to have ways of coping with cool or with the heat in days before air conditioning became the kind of go-to solution. So it's really about shifting patterns of behaviour and creating different kinds of affordances in cities. Again, a mixing of technical and social in a way that's going to come together in hopefully a very accessible way. And lastly, I guess I thought I wanted to point to some other work where we've tried to start to look at the value of creating different kinds of spaces in the city, creating commons, because I think there is a need for a more technical kind of metric that starts to value the social innovations and technical innovations of something like the Urban project in Paris, which took a block of unused land and built a whole community eco-environmental centre around food production, around energy recycling and materials recycling, a kind of innovative eco-social technical innovation, which then got cleared away for a car park because of the need to realise the value of this property in a kind of classic property values sense. So with other colleagues, we've written a paper that starts to revalue all the different goods and forms of well-being, both for people and for the planet, that were generated through this one particular initiative. And this is, again, a need for innovative accounting that has to bring together a kind of an ethical approach to accounting with the techniques that accountants have developed over the years to try and track value. So with that, I'll end, and I just hope that these thoughts, this very quick run through the approach, the community economies approach that I've developed with many others, might stimulate some discussion, and I look forward to hearing from you if you're interested in hearing more about this work. So thank you very much for listening.